Assalamu alaikum, everybody, and welcome to the second webinar series. This is the first day of Ramadan, so I wish you a blessed Ramadan, and I hope that everyone will enjoy this spiritual month. This is a program that we're going to have for the full month of Ramadan every day at this time, and we will be engaging a scholar or a public person about their life, about their accomplishments, about the different aspects of their thoughts, books, and so on and so forth. And I'm very honored today to introduce to you and to have a conversation with a dear friend, someone that I've known for over 30 years. And he's been an icon throughout the United States and the world. He is Professor John Esposito. Professor Esposito, of course, is a professor of religion and international affairs and Islamic studies. He's been also at Georgetown, and he is the founding director of the Center for Muslim Christian Understating, a very renowned center. He's also the founder and as well as the person who's been in charge of the Bridge Initiative, an important initiative that we will also try to explore today. Professor Esposito, of course, is the author of dozens of books, I believe over 50 books. So we have a lot to talk about today. And I'm very, very honored and privileged to have that opportunity. And with me, who will co-host today's program, is Professor Ovamir Anjum. And Professor Anjum is with the University of Toledo in Ohio. He is the Imam Khattab Endowed Chair of Islamic Studies at the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at that university. And his specialty is Islamic intellectual history, as well as social sciences in general. So I want to welcome Professor Esposito and also our co-host, Professor Anjum. Professor Esposito, welcome. And I would like to start by asking you the question, if you can walk us through, basically, you were born right before World War II, and of course that was a very crucial time in the United States, and you grew up also in Brooklyn. Tell us a little bit about your early life, as well as all the way until you got into college briefly, and eventually why you became an expert on Islam. What turned that in? What made you interested in that field?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. I think understanding me is to realize I self-identify as an Italian-American from Brooklyn. I was raised Catholic, very involved in the church. Was an altar boy for many years. I entered the Capuchin Franciscans and was with them roughly from the age of 14 to the age of 24. Something else that influenced me very, very, very much is my wife, Jean, who's both my wife and my partner. One of the interesting things about our relationship, we've been married, I think it's 55 years, yes, was that the first book that she suggested, we might want to read was The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. And I remember years later having a young Muslim graduate student who was not my student, wrote from another university and asked my advice. He said that a woman that he was seeing suggested that he read the book, and he had read the first 30 pages and he could find nothing about tasawwuf. There was nothing on mysticism. And I said, I think she is trying to communicate a different message, and tried to explain to me how to read the book differently. I never intended to study Islam. I did my master's degree in theology, was teaching theology at Rosemont College in Pennsylvania. And I had a unique opportunity. In those days back then, if you were going to get a PhD in a particular religion, you often had to go to either a seminary or a university in that denomination. But Temple University was founded, the religion department at Temple University was a new department which was founded to look at world religions. And I had the opportunity to actually major in Catholicism. And then you had to minor in two other religions, which initially I selected Hinduism and Buddhism. To my astonishment, when I went to talk to the chairman of the department, he suggested that I take a course in Islam with somebody named Ismail Al-Faruqi, who had just come from Syracuse University.
What year
I
was
sort
this?
of declined at the time, and then found that he was fairly insistent, so I agreed to do it. Now, Ismail was a major force, became a major force in my life, because although I agreed that we would have one course, he never agreed to that. And at a certain point, I sort of yielded. He once called me in and said that I should apply for a summer fellowship to study Arabic at the University of Pennsylvania. And I said, well, why would I study Arabic? He said, in order to do major in Islamic studies. I said, but I'm not majoring in Islamic studies. And he said, sit down and fill out the application. So in any case, I did that, and I took his course, and he was just amazing. He's a scholar, teacher, activist, public intellectual, and he came and built that department. And what struck me were a couple of things. One, he was a masterful teacher and mentor and made things come alive. He also knew Christianity, a good deal of Christianity and Judaism, but particularly Christianity, like the back of his hand. In fact, he would embarrass me at times in class because he would presume that I knew everything, and he'd say something like, well, and then again, in St. Paul's epistle, he said what? And sometimes I had the answer, sometimes I didn't. But what was unique about the experience also was that almost everybody in the class were from Muslim countries. Now, James Zogby, who's an American Arab Christian, was also in my class, and one or two others, but everybody else was from Muslim countries. And the reason for that was that Faruqi would go out every year, and he managed to raise money in the Arab world and the broader Muslim world to then bring these students. So we had students coming from Egypt to Malaysia. And that was a unique experience in terms of the training that one would get.
Which years were these? Do you remember?
Which years? This would have been, for me, it would have been the years 1967 to 1974 when I finished my PhD. I usually don't mention those years because then people start to try to figure out what my age is. But in any case, we can move on. Other than my saying, as I say publicly all the time, I run 5 to 6 miles a day. Right. Now we can get back to the realities. What made Faruqi unique also was his impact, from my point of view, in America when it came to Islamic studies, and even in a global way, with just two specific examples. The American Academy of Religion is the preeminent academy for the study of world religions. And yet, in our time, back then in the 1970s, they had no major coverage of Islam. And so Faruqi and myself and some other graduate students went to the AAR and said we thought that Islam should be represented the way Protestantism, Catholicism, etc., were all there. And it took quite a few years. It wasn't until the 1980s that it actually became a permanent, as it were, area within the academy. The other things that he did was to create the International Institute for Islamic Thought in Herndon, Virginia, the American Islamic College in Chicago. So this was a really unique person.
Right. And at that time, you graduated in Islam, particularly in the Islamic religion, and you took your first job at Worcester, was it?
Yes, it was at the College of the Holy Cross, but
right.
I was not hired to teach Islam. And indeed, the new chairman who was coming in made that clear. I was hired, thank God, in a very bad market. Those that were graduating from Temple were in a special position because we could teach several religions because we had to basically study 3, and I had actually studied 4. So I was hired to teach world religions, and I really did not really get to teach courses on Islam itself in terms of being able to pull in students to such a course until the Iranian Revolution. I often say that I owe my career and my first Lexus to Ayatollah Khomeini. I mean, it was such a sea change in the United States at that point.
Tell us about that period.
Well, it was a period in which, if you go back, there's a book written called Protestant, Catholic, and Jew, and that was on religion in America. And the new kid in town that was in that book were the Catholics. So that's the way America was seen in terms of religion. That didn't mean that there weren't, Muslims or Buddhists in the country, but they were seen in terms of their nationality, and they weren't really visible. I was raised in cosmopolitan New York, and not only never ran into a Muslim, never heard that there was, a mosque, etc. When you look at for the government and its training of officials who were going to be going to the Muslim world, they had no program to train them with regard to Islam. I was asked after the Iranian Revolution to get involved in such a program. When you looked at the educational system, kids were not in primary school or high school doing a world history course, let's say, or a world religions course in which they might engage Islam. In general, in their courses, they would be engaging in history. If you think about it, it was very European oriented. It would be Catholicism and Protestantism, and to a certain extent, Judaism. So there was an invisibility. Islam was really invisible. I sent out proposals for books to publishers. No one answered. Well, two did. One said, great idea, no market. And the other said, basically, there's no market for it. All of that changed in 78, 79, 80 with the Iranian Revolution, in which suddenly someone like myself, who hadn't published a book and never thought I'd ever publish a book, had, I think, 3 contracts in 5 weeks. So it was a real transitional period. And I do realize now that for a lot of people, if they don't understand where America was at that time, then they don't understand why, for most Americans, their engagement with Islam was the Iranian Revolution and seeing people every day on TV shouting death to America. And I think that that kind of, and of course, Americans taken hostage. So seeing it through that view, even though there was then a great interest, or more of an interest, it was minimal. One of the morning shows, the popular morning shows, was the Today Show, and they interrupted the coverage looking at what was happening to those in the embassy, the hostages, but by saying, we just want to tell you something briefly about Islam. There's a religion named Islam. It's the second largest of the world religions. Its prophet is Muhammad, and it has a book called the Quran. Now, if you think about that, that is so basic. To feel that that's what an American audience had to hear. Whereas for most of us, when we go to other countries, we kind of expect that they heard the word, Jesus Christ and Bible. So there was a real, if you will, religious / cultural issue here, in terms of absence.
Before I turn it to Professor Anjum, I just want to ask you, since you're very well known throughout the Muslim world, that you have great friendships with many people like Professor Al-Farouqi, which is unique in academia. A lot of professors sometimes, they're experts, but they don't have these deep relationships. How were you able to form that kind of bonds and with friendships and great relationships throughout the Muslim world?
Well, I mean, only God knows. I think part of it was Ismail provided a bit of a gateway because he was, as I said, he was well known, he was fundraising, but he was also speaking in many parts of the Muslim world. And so that then created opportunities for me. And I made a big effort very early in my career. Actually, I think it was before I even finished my PhD, I was teaching at Holy Cross. I took a significant period, almost a year, traveling throughout much of the Muslim world, from Egypt and Sudan all the way to Indonesia. And of course, people had heard of Ismail. I wound up meeting people like Hassan Hanafi in Egypt, Hassan Turabi in the Sudan, Erbakan in Tunisia. I mean, across the board, all the way over to Indonesia. And he influenced a number of them. He provided that kind of entree. For others, it became my entree. And that would be, you had these accidents of history. When I first went to Malaysia, I knew somebody there, and they asked me to speak at the International Islamic University there, which was just in its beginnings. And we had, the first, we thought it would just be one meeting. But what happened was it really took off. It was just, and part of it was that I was this, for some people, this unique person. I was a non-Muslim, so they wondered, why did I study Islam? Was I associated with, with the State Department or a security, agency like the CIA? And then when I spoke, no matter what I spoke about, people would raise their hand and say, if you understand Islam and Muslims so well, why aren't you a Muslim? And as a result of that kind of interest, etc., I then wound up spending, I think, a week every day giving series of lectures, along those lines. And I had a similar situation years later in Saudi Arabia along the same lines. People expected that to be, if you were a Westerner, at least for many people, and you were talking about Islam, it was going to be coming from, first of all, that you probably really wouldn't know what Islam really is like, etc., and that you would be coming from a certain position, for example, an Orientalist position, and there was a sense for some that I could feel, as it were, from within, and I think part of that was the people that my classmates, that you couldn't be in class with people for the number of years that I was and not be able to do that. I can tell you when I first began, studying, I was very naive. One of the students was Anis Ahmad, the brother of Khurshid Ahmad of the Jamaati Islami, and so was Anis. But when we had our first exam, he asked to borrow my book. And I said, well, I need it. The exam's on Tuesday. So I said, I need it by such and such a date. He said, Inshallah, I'll return it. Well, that was okay. But he said, Inshallah, about 3 or 4 more times. And finally, I said, look, Anis, now I'm getting nervous. You have to be more specific about when I'm going to get my book back. I went from that to then becoming very immersed as a result of traveling in the Muslim world, but also, again, Faruqi just opened up gateways so that I would be at a very early stage attending conferences held in the US that brought Muslims from different parts of the world, and Islamic groups and organizations, whether it was eventually ISNA or the MSA, etc. I became very visible. And then, I don't know, after that, it just happened.
All right. Well, allow us to, I want to ask about in Islamic scholarship in the U.S. at that time and as it grew. But before that, I want you, if you could start with your relationship with Faruqi a little more. He has some very interesting and original ideas about how he interprets the growth of this religious tradition. For instance, in his Trilogue of Abrahamic Faiths, right? He has an interpretation of Christianity. Did you ever feel that you debated with him and you felt that, well, that was something that he didn't know, or that, he shouldn't be talking about that, or that's not really his area?
Yeah, I took Faruqi, first of all, Faruqi was very impressive certainly for me, given my background, etc. Ismail was fluent in 4 or 5 languages. He knew Western culture very well. He went to a Catholic primary school. He went to AUB, and he studied, philosophy at Harvard University, and then also did his PhD at Indiana. So he knew Western thought, both intellectual and Christian thought, and he was very sharp. He had some strong opinions. For example, one of the things that I always remember that he did was within the department, we had professors of religion and whom he got along with, but some of them, it was during the period that was so-called the God is dead theology period. And some of that was challenging some traditional Christian, obviously, beliefs, about Jesus or the virgin birth, etc. And Ismail, imitating Martin Luther, had his list of what the issues were, as it were, the Christian issues that he was going to defend, and challenging a colleague. And so he put it on the door, and that shot through the graduate students. Ismail had very strong opinions, but by and large, I never found his opinions offensive. There were times when I might, and say, gee, in fact, I remember one time when he was talking about how he was going to, he was concerned about something, very concerned, and I was at his home, and how he was going to present it. And both his wife, Lois, or Lamia, and I said, well, you might want to present it, but do it in a kind of more sort of, trying to say, in a kind of more laid back kind of way, because he had a dynamic, strong personality. And when he was really concerned, he could come across as strongly sometimes as I may when I'm speaking, so I really didn't have, an issue with him. Some did, no doubt about it. But some of that also had to do with the kind of, if you will, the divisions that could exist among scholars. That is, a fair number of the top scholars at the time of religion were Christian in background and or in practice. And for some of them, even those that sometimes dealt with Islam, there was a distinction in their mind between, if you will, the Muslim wing and themselves. And I was seen as part of the Muslim wing because when we did the program, tried to get Islam accepted at the American Academy of Religion, our group was made up of mostly young Muslim graduate students, and then a Jewish graduate student, and myself, a Catholic graduate student. And I knew that we were kind of viewed as part of the Muslim wing. And there could be obvious, and this has continued over the years, obvious implications about level of objectivity. To give you a specific example, one of my classmates was interviewed as a very young scholar after he finished his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania for a position in the department and in Islam. But in effect, what the department chair said to him after entering into a conversation, he said, I want people who are going to be objective about religion, and it's going to be kind of difficult for you to be objective about religion. In effect, he was saying, if you believe that the Quran is the word of God, the literal word of God, etc. And actually, what they wound up doing for Catholicism, for Islam, there was to hire a Jesuit priest. And it was the opposite of Temple. Temple, the professors of a religion had to be either born into the religion or converts. And if they were born into the religion, it wasn't necessary that they necessarily were still active in their religion. In other words, they could have been born and raised in the religion, but not practicing. But they needed that kind of association with the religion or a convert to the religion. For others of a more, what I would regard as a kind of more secular orientation, this would not help your objectivity in studying. And so there were times, I'm sure, when people would hear the way I would speak or interpret Islam, that whereas many Muslims would identify it and initially wonder why I was that way. For others, I think they would probably say, well, he was Ismail al-Faruqi's student. I was his first PhD, actually. First person.
So how are you taken? So you have this new approach to Islam, and then you go into Islamic studies and you find, if you will, perhaps the elephant in the room. It's Bernard Lewis, it's the Orientalists, it's Wansborough and whatnot. How did they interact with your scholarship, with your style? What were the conferences like?
Well, it really depended. Bringing up Bernard's a good example. First of all, again, remember, I was still a kind of new kid in the profession in the following sense. I came from Temple University, which had been a Baptist college and then became a significant secular university, if you will. And I came from a new religion department. As far as I know, in those days, people who did their degrees in Islamic studies, there was no religion department where you could do it. They did it in history departments, etc. And so I think, and the fact that I was also Italian American and first generation to go to college or university, in the minds of some, I think that would be, an issue. So all of that was there. When it comes to Bernard Lewis, there's no doubt about the fact that that at the end of the day, We did not get along, but I think that was basically on Lewis's part. In my early part of my career, I used to use one of his books. I think it was The History of the Arabs, which was very good. But when Lewis began to shift more and more into talking about not historically the early period of Islam, but talking more and more about contemporary Islam, I had a problem with that. And I had a problem with his position, his movement into a kind of staunch Zionist, position when it came to talking about Palestine and Israel. And it was there. I mean, and I'd get the feedback. So I remember chairing a professional situation and then having a young Muslim graduate student who was at Princeton say, could he see me during the break? And during the break, he said to me, I think you should know that Professor Lewis it really has, issues with you. And what Lewis was upset about was that although he had published with Oxford University Press and other presses, I was the one who was made the editor-in-chief of the first Oxford Encyclopedia on the Islamic world and in such things. So Lewis also saw a colleague of mine, a younger academic, and said, to have that piece in this encyclopedia, you might want to write something like that, and I'll put it in a better place for you to see it. And then we had a number of places where we would differ publicly at the Council on Foreign Relations and in a variety of areas. So we were in a very different place. Samuel Huntington with the Clash of Civilizations was, could be very professional and civil, as it were, dealing with him. But we had some issues there. I was invited, as he was, to Saudi Arabia to sort of debate his Clash of Civilizations. And then subsequently, I'd be at a conference with him or whatever. And I remember raising the question about, when you talk about the potential clash between Islam and the West, why do you say that Islam has bloody borders? Why wouldn't you say Muslim countries have bloody borders? And also, are you taking into account the fact that Muslim countries that border on each other don't necessarily get along with each other? And I gave some examples. Well, that didn't go down. And then when his book came out, he and I did an interview in Washington. I raised the same question, that he didn't change it. And not only did he say Islam has bloody borders, he then said, and it has bloody innards. A very strong sort of statement. So we had our differences there. And I would say, yeah, go ahead.
I may ask you about your books. I mean, obviously you have a lot of books. Just walk us through how you decide about writing a particular book, not from the publisher point of view, but from your intellectual curiosity, and also what are your favorite books throughout this period?
Yeah, so I never thought I'd do a book. I happened to chair a session at the American Academy of Religion on Islam and development, and I invited a number of people. Most of them were actually, in those days, you would get people that were familiar with the Muslim world, et cetera, but they were more political scientists, et cetera, rather than having, like a rich cross-section of specialists on Islam who dealt with the modern and contemporary period. I mean, that was another issue too, that the field, in terms of the people that were out there, many of them were people who did their work on the early period and the medieval period, but many of them didn't take the modern period seriously because the whole approach was that modernization meant the secularization, of society. And so I had wanted to write anyway, I did this panel, and then after it, the publisher of Syracuse University Press came up to me and said, gee, would you like to do a book on it? And I was stunned, because this is when there was no interest really in Islam. And so I then put together a group of people, and I was interested in the topic. How can we talk about Islam as an alive religion? And so I had like a specialist on Egypt who could actually write in that way, could say that, well, the received wisdom at that time in the social sciences, et cetera, was that religion would keep, as it were, receding, and receding from the public space as well. And he was seeing the extent to which that was not the case if you look closely in Egypt. So we did, that kind of book. Another book that I did early on was, in light of the Iranian Revolution, I ran a private conference, and that's when I first met John Vole, who's had a tremendous influence on my development. And that private conference was basically based on, and we called it Voices of Resurgent Islam. And so we invited people like Hassan Turabi, Anwar Ibrahim, etc., with some media, some academics, some government people. It was a good conference, but it didn't yield what I wanted. About 1/3 of it worked. And so then I added other studies. And then a third one that I did initially was, now I was also teaching. I was always very sensitive. My writing has to do with my interests, which are very much the vitality of Islam in any period, but certainly in the modern and contemporary period, but also books that are written for students and for educated professionals. So, I mean, in other words, I do books that I want to feel that I'm going to have a good audience is going to read it. I'm not interested in writing a book that 25 other people are going to be interested in. In this case, I really felt I was beginning to now be able to teach Islam, that we didn't have a lot of materials out there. So I did a book called Islam in Transition. And that was a collection of writings looking at Arab and Muslim writers, let's say from the 19th and 20th century. And looking at with selections and looking at the issues that were there. And I did it with actually a brilliant Jesuit priest, Father Jack Donahue, or John Donahue, who had done his PhD at Oxford. So I was often running in that kind of situation. And then a book that I wanted to write, but that Faruqi had discouraged me from, was an introduction to Islam, because he said to me, "You're new in the field.
But I thought you had one. It's and I've been using it.
Say that again.
Had one. I thought you had one, and I have been using it.
Oh, Islam the Straight Path. That's
yes.
That was it.
That's
Yeah,
right.
and that was. I then wound up writing that later after these other books, because by then Faruqi, I think, felt I was seasoned, and also we moved to another relationship. I wasn't just still his student, and so we could have a good give and take. But I wrote it at the time because what I noticed was there were a number of good books out there. Fazlur Rahman had a book on Islam, but it was written more, from my point of view, would have been more aimed at graduate students, right, and that kind of level in terms of when you think about a leadership and a broad leadership. Whether it was his book or Mohammedanism by Gibb, they tended to have the last 2 centuries in the shortest chapter. They put, the last 2 centuries in one short chapter. One of the books did it all in 15 pages. And so I really felt that, I wanted to do a book called Islam, the Straight Path that really gave you the historical perspective. It also looked at what was happening in Islam and in Muslim countries, if you will, in 20th century.
Tell me about your motivation for 2 particular books, which you became very famous for: Islam, Myth or Reality, and The Unholy War.
Yeah, well, the Islamic threat, myth or reality actually grew out of it. Was just you had the fall of the Soviet Union around that time, and you also had Saddam and the first Gulf War around that time. And my wife and I were sitting one afternoon talking, and I just said that my concern was that Islam would be seen as the next global threat, and then we really talked about it and teased it out. And ironically, the day that I signed the contract with Oxford, I was at the State Department, asked to brief the secretary. It's at the secretary's level, at the top level, that dealt with. So it was like that dealt with, if you will, religion and human rights, or something like that. And sure enough, I mean, I went up to speak with him, and one of the first things he said to me was, "Do you think Algeria will become another Iran?" Because they had the elections in Algeria, not just that there was an explosion in terms of violence, which did occur, but this was at the time when it was just the idea that suddenly people were seeing Islamic parties coming where there were elections. They were doing well in the elections. The Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan and in Egypt. They saw it in a number of different countries. In Turkey, you began to have in a very secular state, you began to have people like Erbakan and the Welfare Party, et cetera, emerging. So I wrote the book really to deal with that question. Is there this kind of Islamic threat? And then,
did you feel that the government officials you were dealing with were receptive to the message you were trying to?
Well, they were at a certain point, but I can say this. At one point, a little earlier than that, I was at the American Academy of Religion meeting, and because I had done a postdoc at Harvard, when they had their social, I went there with great trepidation. Harvard was still very much from a distance for me, even though I had done this postdoc. And Wilford Cantwell Smith was there, who was a major figure at that time. And I mentioned that I had been. The government had asked me. That is, the government asked me. They had a program called. What was it? AMPART, American Participants, and they would bring American academics out, not in the field of religion. It was more lawyers, historians of American history, et cetera, to talk about America in terms of its history, education, et cetera. But then somebody thought they ought to have somebody in Islam, and there was a big debate about whether or not such a person should exist. And then, of course, selecting me as a non-Muslim, to do it. But I remember talking with Cantwell Smith about this opportunity, and he said, be careful of government. He said, in my experience, they just use what you say. And then you had the U.S. bombing of Libya, in which they killed Gaddafi's child, but it was the nature of the bombing. And Cantwell Smith and I did not know each other, and he called me on the phone and said, I've changed my mind. He said, I'm going to speak to the person who handles foreign affairs in Canada. He was a Canadian citizen. And I would encourage you to get involved in speaking to people at the State Department. It's important that this occur. But it wasn't until, I could be wrong here, Sami, but if I remember correctly, it wasn't until maybe around 1984 or so that the Foreign Service Institute began to really have first-rate coverage of not only the Middle East, but of Islam in the Middle East. And I became involved with Peter Bechdahl, who ran the program, and others were involved, like John Vole. But before that, none of that had kind of existed. And then you mentioned, what was the other book? Unholy War?
Unholy War.
Yeah, well, what happened when 9/11 occurred, I thought I'll write a new edition, update Islamic threat. But my editor said, Oxford's interested, but they'd like you to write a new book, a separate book, and look at the rise of Al-Qaeda. But in other words, it can be broader than that. It's not that it has to be a book just on Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, et cetera. And so that's how Unholy War developed. But I just introduce here and connect one thing that was happening. My wife has worked with me on all of my books. I mean, she had her own career in education and then in business, but she was always interested in what I was doing. And in the middle of writing Unholy War, I've been doing a lot of media interviews and also government stuff. She said, I think you need to write a Q&A on Islam. And I said, well, I have to do this book, and I don't know. She said, John, you get off every time and you complain that you're asked the same questions that you were asked a decade or two ago. I actually got to a point in my career when I would speak, whether it was in government or publicly, I say things like, well, I'm really in a very fortunate, though frustrating situation. People ask me the same questions they asked me when I first started out. And the only difference is that now I get invited around the world to answer them, and I also get paid for it. But I mean, there wasn't, so we did them simultaneously. We did Unholy War, and we did what everyone needs to know about Islam. My motivation with Unholy War, from the very title, was to put into perspective this whole notion that somehow inherent in Islam is an overriding drive to engage in, quote, holy wars.
Right. Ovamir.
Yeah. So I wanted to take us to the Muslim world. You were involved from the beginning with a number of important figures, intellectuals in the Islamic movements, the revivalist movements. There is on this side of the Atlantic, they are understood as fundamentalists. Mm-hmm. And you were trying to talk to both sides. And then people like Khurshid Ahmed, Anis Ahmed, people like Turabi.
Mm.
So how are these conversations like, and how are you tell us a little more also about your interactions with people like Turabi or Khurshid Ahmed.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's kind of interesting because most people wouldn't believe this, but I'm basically privately and personally shy and an introvert, which people who only know me when they see me publicly would say the last thing I would expect is that you're actually an introvert, but I am. So that really raised some issues. You arrive in a country that you don't know, or you're not super familiar with, whether it's Egypt or the Sudan, it's your first time, and you're going to try to get appointments. Well, in some situations, because of Ismail, for example, in Turabi's situation, I could get to see him, and Hassan had come back, and he was the head of the law school, and then in his early period with the National Islamic Front, and but I found that one was able to connect. Now, what had happened is, when I did my conference on Voices of Resurgent Islam, I brought Hassan to that conference, along with a number of other people like Khurshid Ahmad and Anwar Ibrahim. And then we did the book, and Hassan wasn't getting his chapter in, and I remembered that he had said that the only time that he wrote was when he was in prison. So I finally wrote to him and said, if this is the environment that you need, I would be happy if you came here, and I will bring you every day to Holy Cross. I will put you in an office, and you'll basically be locked in that office, as it were, and I'll take you out for lunch, and then you'll go back into that office, and then you can come out for dinner, and you can see me, and he stayed at my home. And so that's how I actually got to know him. He actually accepted, given the way I laid it out, and we began to really develop a personal relationship. I also introduced him. He did a major thing with the major media newspapers, at that time in the area. And so over the years, I became interested in writing about Hassan and the group. What fascinated me about Hassan is, on the one hand, first of all, I knew when he would come to the US, he was a very popular speaker, across the United States in terms of Muslim students and at universities, et cetera. And I knew his visibility overseas, because he was very bright, but he's a terrific speaker, and he could do it in Arabic, French, and English, without any problem. But it was that trying to bring out like who he was, what he was really like. And when a lot of people aren't aware of the fact that very early in his career, he wrote a book on women in Islam, which would have been seen as a reformist book, at that period. But that wasn't the part of him that he got a lot of attention for. And what happened was John Vole and I both got interested in these kinds of folks. And so John and I did a number of books in which we went and interviewed people like Hassan Turabi, Anwar Ibrahim, Khurshid, a slew of people, and Ghanouchi, et cetera. And we did chapters on their lives and their thought. We sort of called them, it depended on who they were, but they would be, sort of scholar activists, depending on the situation. And that really had me for a long time making contact, so that it went over to Indonesia and dealing with Abdurrahman Wahid, who was the head of NU, the largest Islamic organization in the world, and also the first president of Indonesia. And we weren't paying attention to that. By we, I mean the US. I can remember when the Secretary of State with Clinton, I think it was Warren Christopher, if I remember correctly, in the first term, he spoke at Georgetown, and a group of us on the Middle East, but our 4 faculty met with him before. And so we talked about the Middle East. And then at the end of it, I said, Mr. Secretary, I know that you're going to Indonesia. What's the agenda and what do you see? And he said, honestly, I don't know much about Indonesia, but here's my right-hand person, and you need to talk to him. And when Abdurrahman Wahid became president of Indonesia, I had a phone call from the State Department with somebody who wanted to have a long conversation about him. And I was stunned that if you are working on Indonesia, that's the State Department, given Abdurrahman Wahid's visibility, the kind of organization that he led, et cetera, that there wasn't more familiarity. But that's because Southeast Asia wasn't taken seriously. So that's how and then with Shia, just to make some references, I got to know Musa Sadr because I was in Beirut, and I went and had an interview with him, and did questioning, etc. I also spent time with Ayatollah Fadlallah, who in his early days of Hezbollah, he was associated with them, and then he withdrew and focused more on his writings, etc. To my surprise, the first day that I was at Georgetown, Ayatollah Mesbah Yazdi from Iran had been in New York, and he came to see me. I don't know why. He had called me and said he wanted to see me. I actually didn't know him. I hadn't been to Iran at that time. And then I got to know Khatami, during a period of time. So I've always been fascinated with, if you will, seeing Islam through the eyes of a diverse group of people, many of them leaders of Islamic movements, or sort of, modern thinkers that have kind of an impact on politics and society. And in the earlier days, it was because in my writings, I could then have primary sources, selections from them, and write about them at a time when people weren't really paying attention to them. I mean, one of the great examples I would just give here is that a man named James Bill, first rate on Iran. And in fact, he was rumored as a possible ambassador to Iran after the revolution. Now, Jim told me that he did his PhD at Princeton, and they never looked at the modern and contemporary period. So he did deal with Islam in early Iranian history, but not the modern. And that it was when he went to Iran that he was in many ways blown away by the vitality and the diversity and richness of, if you will, modern Islam, modern or contemporary Islam. So
allow me to ask you to go back in a little bit with some of your earlier relationships with these. Of course, your relationship with these people goes, it seems to me, it's gone two ways. So you, in fact, seem to have brought a new face of America to them. And I think that in many ways, they are also shaped by this friendship.
I could give you an example. In the Iranian case, I happened to see Khatami when he was interviewed by Christian, the reporter, and he worked into the interview and talked about a dialogue of civilizations, raising that, and that became a big issue. And so I somehow was able to make contact with I think it was the Iranian ambassador maybe at the UN. And so I wound up going to Iran and meeting with the equivalent of the person that handled foreign relations. And eventually I met with Khatami, and we developed a relationship then. But in that early stage, and what was interesting was that what I developed was what I was able to get an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, in which we, that is the center, and that would be myself and one or two of my colleagues, would be coming to Tehran to speak at the equivalent of their Foreign Service Institute and some other places. And then we would go to Qom. And what was interesting about going to Qom was that it was Khatami's people themselves that said, don't just go to the progressive, because I was going to some progressive places and people to speak with. You should go to some of the more traditionalist or and sort of more hardcore. So Ayatollah Mesbah Yazdi, was this person, very learned, etc. And we did a conference on secularism and democracy, and it was a closed conference, which was very, very, very honest, and there was a real cross-fertilization going back and forth, and the same thing happened when I did stuff both in this situation and other times in Tehran. But where there was a blowback was that when it became time for Ayatollah Mesbah's group and people that they selected to come to the United States, the concern was how would they be treated when they came through security. And so I'd got in touch with people at the State Department who basically said, we will write a letter, et cetera, but we don't control what goes on in the airport. That's another agency in government. And so we planned the conference. And when the day came, it was a closed conference. They were a half hour late. They were an hour late, an hour and a half late. I couldn't figure out what happened. And then I had a phone call, and they were right in the area. They were in Virginia, but they had been so handled and mishandled that they decided that they would not participate in the program, although they invited me to come and then talk to them and talk with them about what went down. So it mirrored, the problems that existed, and they've continued to exist. I mean, one of the important statements made by an Iranian American who taught at the University of Virginia for many years was that there was a process, regrettably, of mutual Satanization in the way that Iran unfolded and the US unfolded and the continuing relationship. And I did see that over the years when you'd be in conferences on the Middle East. As soon as you would get to Iran, regardless of what was happening, there was this tendency to be very negative and suspicious about everything. And I also saw it often when I would be in Iran, speaking and lecturing. When one dealt with America, people would then bring up, of course, America's history in terms of European colonialism, its relationship with Iran, also the question of the CIA, etc. So what I tried to do with my conferences and my speaking engagements was to kind of, sort of cross borders, and then if I could help others to cross borders and come here. And it worked very well with Khatami, because Khatami's first big conference in Iran, he showed who he was in being inclusive, and he invited a lot of the reformist professors and religious leaders, as well as the more conservative and some even hardliners, to a big conference, and invited Gene and I to come to it. And so I could then see them in action, and you could really get a sense of the diversity within Iran. Because as I said when I got up to speak, that I had never heard so many speeches about democracy and its roots in America and Europe. Very constructive. But you had all these people who were reformers doing this.
Right, John, we got about close to 25 minutes or so. So I'm trying to run through different topics. So we'll be rushing a bit. I want to take you back to the early 90s. You may remember, we talked about Hassan al-Turabi, we talked about Khurshid Ahmed. If you remember Wise, at the time we invited them, we had this engagement. We were very optimistic that there is this atmosphere now where Islam could be taken seriously. We have all these academics coming and discussing serious topics very objectively, without this stereotyping. And then suddenly we have a shift, when Martin Kramer started writing on others, and we had Rashid Ghannouchi blocked from coming to that conference, and then things deteriorated after that. And I wanted to look back at that era and see where we are now and the state of Islamic studies in the United States today. Is it better or worse, particularly after 9/11? And where do you see the future of that?
Yeah, I think that what you did have early on is the emergence, particularly, a number of the people who were it's not just, but students of Bernard Lewis, like Martin Kramer, brilliant, etc., born in America, but a citizen of both America and Israel, and spent almost all of his career in Israel, although he would come here and lecture. And others began to really emerge around that time, Daniel Pipes and others. What I saw, and ironically, I think it was the second or third edition of my book, Islamic Threat. I was writing before 9/11 actually occurred. And I started to look at media in the UK and the US in the 1990s. And what I saw emerging, although it wasn't as visible as today, were the beginnings of very, from my point of view, anti-Islam and anti-Muslim kinds of articles. A pipe sort of thing. The Muslims are coming. The Muslims are coming. Those kinds of pieces in media there. And so for Islamic Threat, I felt I needed to deal with this phenomenon of Islamophobia. The irony was that the whole notion of Islamophobia emerged, and that very term, and was got a lot of attention in the UK. In the US, we didn't use the word Islamophobia until the debate over the mosque at Ground Zero. But what did happen with 9/11, obviously, is, and against the background of the initial engagement with Islam for many, a cross-section of people with the Iranian Revolution, 9/11, you have an attack on the homeland, if you will, an attack that would have been seen as virtually impossible. And that impact was, I want to say beyond belief. And it's not that one shouldn't believe that Americans were traumatized, but it was the extent of it. I did not travel that year. I rather overseas. I traveled throughout the United States. And, you could see at every level of society, people grappling with the attack on 9/11. And to the extent that it was framed, committed by bin Laden, and framed in many ways, by him to legitimate what he did, in terms of not only a critique of the US, but also in terms of legitimating it in the name of Islam. It was the beginning of what then emerged and continued over the years, so that by 2015, you could have major studies done by outfits like Media Tenor saying that Islamophobia had grown so significantly that it had become normalized. And in the UK, Baroness Worsey made the comment that it had become acceptable. How did she use the phrase? Like acceptable dinner conversation, to engage in this kind of anti-Muslim attitude and behaviors. And
Bernard Lewis crowd, if you will. Bernard Lewis crowd hit a jackpot with 9/11 in the U.S.
A number of the people associated with him, definitely did. And they weren't just scholars; they were also some media people. Charles Krauthammer, Judith Miller, who had been writing even domestically more and more about both the international situation, but also writing about the domestic threat. And that created, a significant momentum. So much so that in the studies that we've done on Bridge, and if people go to bridge.georgetown.edu, they can see where we report on literally the hundreds of millions of dollars that have gone to these Islamophobic authors and centers. Many of which have these nice sounding names, like American Thinker, Family Security, etc. But it made it legitimate. You could say, from my point of view, it was a time when you got to a point where almost anything could be said publicly or in a newspaper, and it would fly. Whereas I used to say to people, take out the word Islam and put Judaism or Christianity or Catholicism, or put in, whatever, Italian Americans, or etc. And an editor wouldn't publish it, or be really very careful. But that wasn't the case, and hasn't been the case.
Talk a little more about the Bridge Initiative. How, what led to it?
Yeah, the Bridge Initiative grew out of my being very concerned, both in my speaking and my writing, etc. About the growth of Islamophobia, and particularly also the way it was reflected in both major media and social media. And in the last 10 years, it's more social media that has much more of an impact than major media in many ways. And so I created it, I think, about 6 years ago. And what we did is bring together, hire some younger sort of researchers, and also working with some of my colleagues, like Tamara San, who's the current director of the center. And if people go to the Bridge, what we try to do is provide an incredible amount of information. So, for example, every day, one of my staff people, who's actually based in London now, every day she will identify 10 or 20 major pieces that have occurred globally, and particularly in Europe and America, but also it can be globally. And we also have somebody in Vienna who also is a specialist on Europe. and she will summarize each of these articles. So it's a great resource for people to keep track on this. But we also created an area called fact sheets. And that's important because part of what you want to do is to just have facts so that people don't say when you write an article and you're also giving your opinion, then you get into debating this and that. But rather fact sheets. So if you look, we have major coverage, for example, on President Trump. What was he like as a candidate? What did he do and say as president? But also we look at his cabinet, the then Attorney General. We look at Pompeo and a number of other senior members in the administration who were associated with groups like Act for America, even received a reward from them. And we look at these. If you go there, you can see us doing that with, for example, all the countries in Europe. We also do it with Australia. We deal with the situation in China. And we now have 1.1 million followers, which is, from my point of view, it's kind of incredible for that site. And it's been quoted a lot by media, but it's because I felt that you had what not just me, but others talk about, this Islamophobia industry, a group of individuals and organizations who get funded and who cross-fertilize each other. What I mean by that is they often, if somebody, for example, writes an article critical of me, it will then also, a version of it may be picked up on another website. And so it becomes more of a fact, so that when people go to do a check on the internet and they want to look up my name or somebody else's name, etc., they'll often see a slew of articles without realizing that these people are cross-fertilizing, what they're doing. And we looked at the amount of money. There is none of us, we have a very limited number of programs that deal with Islamophobia. I probably now, but not after this year, because of funding issues, but until this year, probably had the largest permanent staff, and that was about 6 people, doing research, etc. And you look at these other groups that have been getting funding, as I said, that ultimately comes out somewhere between $250 million and possibly $300 million. And these accusations or facts are based on IRS returns. So you're seeing an overwhelming, incredible force. And then when you look at Europe today, you have countries like Poland and Hungary that don't have many Muslims at all and are very Islamophobic, or Australia. So we've done a lot on all of these, providing this kind of information. And then
it is an incredible project I can see on the website, and I encourage everybody actually to check it out. I want to switch gears. We have about 12 minutes left, so and focus a little bit on the Arab Spring. I mean, you've been an observer, you've seen the different trajectories all the way from what happened in '92 in Algeria, and then what happened also in 2006, where democracy was always the charge that the Muslim populations or Muslim countries do not honor democracy, they don't care for democracy. And then we have this wave, obviously, when I refer to 2006, I'm talking about what happened in Palestine in the elections and the rejection of the so-called international community to the results of these elections. And then we see what happened in 2011, and everybody was so optimistic that now we're coming to the Arab world has come now alive, and we're going to see this wave of democratization. And then we saw also the real result from a president who just 2 years before gave this speech in Cairo University, and I think you helped a little bit with that speech, I believe. And then we saw that again another failure of Western countries, particularly the United States, when it came to the choice between supporting democratic forces and those who would like to take us back to repressive and dictatorial and authoritarian regimes. And you wrote about this in the book. Tell us about how you saw it and where it's going.
Yeah, I think we forget the issue that the extent to which European colonialism, but also American neocolonialism has been a major force in the creation and/or support of governments, many of them authoritarian, and a fair number of governments that are actually family-owned countries. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, et cetera, Jordan, et cetera, that, that these are family-owned countries and governments, many of them authoritarian. And the reality of it is that so much of our foreign policy was not based necessarily always by diplomats who just loved authoritarian governments, but those who believed that this was the best bet to have a sort of a stable country and a stable society, and that this was in the interest of America, or Europe. And I think that for many Americans, they just have no sense of that. When you think about Americans or Europeans who would be traveling in the past to countries like Egypt and others, they'd have no idea about how full their prisons were under their governments. I remember having a student who was from Jordan and then was in the government. And when I first went to visit, we went by the Ministry of Interior, and he said, that's a place I wouldn't want to be called to go to. And for a second, I just come from America, and I thought, Ministry of Interior in the US, it has to do with trees,
Right.
et cetera. So you've got a different. So when the Arab Spring came, I remember being there, during it, and when the Morsi government came in. And I was talking to a young man who was not a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, but a kind of reporter and writer. And he happened to take out for me a picture of Mubarak, and then next to him, a picture of all the American presidents who Mubarak had interfaced with. And basically he was saying, this is the only president that I know, given my age. And look at, this is a president who, in your country, all these other presidents have known and kind of dealt with. And I think, for many, there was a sense that that there would be democratization in the future, but it certainly wasn't there in the background. I mean, for years, the Middle East Studies Association, which is a first-rate outfit, would have programs, but almost nothing on democracy. I'm talking about going back to like 70s and 80s, any real focus on that. It was just, it just wasn't accepted as a significant possibility or variable. So when you had what happened in Tunisia and in Egypt, and saw the cross-section of people that were in the streets, there was a sense that this would be a step forward. And even if there were differences, you would not have the kind of reversal that took place in Egypt. And the reality
that counter revolution. Talk about, did you see MBZ and MBS coming? Did you see this? Did we in the academia, do we have tools to understand what's going on? Or was this happening under our noses in Washington all along?
Well, I think the problem was that we absolutely weren't prepared for it. None of our presidents were. Think about the response initially of the Obama administration. Within the first week or two, you would have a statement made by the president on the one hand and the Secretary of State on the other. And so one of them would say, President Mubarak has been one of our closest allies. And the other one would say, we respect the right of the people. They didn't know what way to go. They weren't prepared to go that way. And at least in some subsequent writing, I have seen statements saying that that basically the Secretary of State, Clinton, did not think that we should be really very accepting of the change that took place. What we didn't know, I don't think many people in the academy or any place, was the extent to which for a year before. So after the election of Morsi, you then had a senior person who ran against him and who had been in the Mubarak government, who then went to the Gulf, and many people felt that he went there because of that he might be arrested because of business deals that he did or incorrect stuff. Actually, for the year before, there then was a development of, as it were, an approach funded by and supported by the UAE and Saudi Arabia. So that for that year before, a lot of what was then going to go on back in Egypt was being bankrolled. And so they bankrolled, ultimately if you will, the coup that took place, and they bankrolled the period after to a significant extent. At the end of the day, the international community accepted it. President Obama said it's not a coup. And as a very prominent academic who also served in the State Department and is back in the academy, said in an interview, a coup is a coup is a coup. In other words, you look at the definition, this was a coup, a military coup. When it came to Tunisia, Tunisia provided a transition with elections that were clean. And I think there was and I'd been in Tunisia quite a bit around that time, and there was an expectation that the US and the UK, maybe, a number of them would be helping to support now these new governments, that had replaced.
So John, if I may, what would you tell, in the past, for the past 20, 25 years, the message coming from Washington, including from academics, the Islamic movements, embrace democracy, go all the way and contest it, and so on and so forth. And they did that. Now they saw the betrayal of this message. So what would you tell them? What should they do? And what would you, how would you explain it also to American policymakers back in Washington about what kind of policies they should embrace? Because obviously that kind of message, what happened in 2013 and beyond, is basically saying that we don't care about democracy. All what we care about is our interest and securing these interests, including having repressive and dictatorial regimes.
Well, I think the first thing that one has to say is, but people aren't going to want to really go back and look at it, is say, we never really, meaning government, never really made a significant distinction between Islamic movements that participated within the political arena and did that consistently and nonviolently, and the actions of extremists, so that the words like Islamic fundamentalism could be used and other kinds of words along the way. I think that one of the things that needs to be emphasized now is that, what we're seeing is that Saudi Arabia and the UAE not only bankrolled with, what happened in Egypt and then avoided, helping Tunisia, except that now the UAE is getting involved, I think, and disturbing the situation in Tunisia. But what's emerged is that you now have, on the one hand, a concern on the part of countries, some of the countries in the Gulf, not all, about that the wave would come. They didn't expect that a group like the Muslim Brotherhood or any group was going to come to their country, but that the ideas, and if there was success, that then they could have problems within their own country. Now you have a situation where the UAE and Saudi Arabia, to greater and lesser extents, really see themselves and want to be the major force in the Gulf and expect support from Western governments rather than the reverse. And you see how much more assertive, for example, certainly initially the UAE and NBS and MBZ, but following what was developed in the UAE, a list of Islamic movements, including mainstream as well as extremist, and promoting this as these are these terrorist organizations, and sending the stuff to the UK and the United States and other places of Europe, and even getting to a point where President Obama himself wound up responding. And I think it also happened in the UK, but certainly Obama himself said, you've got a number of American organizations, Muslim organizations, and we don't see that being the situation. But they're approaching it from that point of view. So what they're really saying is anything other than the way we want to run our country is a problem. And so what you get is the facade, because they can be very modern, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, if you listen to some of the speeches at times that are made by leaders, and if you go there, there's a lot of, quote, new buildings, people, if you look at Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince has opened up his society in some ways, but at the same time that he was opening it up for women to drive cars, he arrested some of the prominent women academics and others who had been fighting for broader rights, including driving a car, but broader rights, and imprisoned them and held some of them for a number of years. all of that's
Are
really,
you
that's new.
advising the current administration in any way, shape, or form?
No, not at all.
No. Okay. All right. Final question. Very briefly, 1 minute. Ovamir, if you have a final question for the professor.
Well, I'm wondering if, given that your Bridge Initiative, you're tracking what's going on in these countries. In fact, so we've heard, for instance, the UAE funding of Islamophobia in the West, right? To what extent is that a force, and to what extent we as academics, as Muslims in the West, should worry about that?
Oh, I think that we should. I mean, I think that what we're seeing simultaneously is Islamophobia growing in France and Austria under governments that normally were seen as very international, etc. And the fact is that you now have a cross-fertilization taking place from the region, from Europe to America, but you also have in the post-Arab Spring a number of the countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia positioning themselves much better in the United States and in some countries overseas. Their influence in terms of funding programs or even developing new programs. And I think that one needs to be concerned about that. I also think, just to bring this to a close, there are those that basically say that we're in a post-Islamism period. I think that there's a truth to it if one is saying that the 80s and 90s you saw Islamic parties and organizations functioning in politics, etc., and mainstream and doing well. I think now we're in a situation where there's a lot of concern about the future, where some movements are going to be even more repressed, where there's a lot of debate within the Muslim Brotherhood with different factions. But there's no doubt about the fact that however one wants to view it, there will be new ways forward. And an example would be Tunisia, where Ghanouchi, the leader of Ennahda, and Ennahda won the first elections very well, and they adapted to the government. But more recently, they have separated out the political and religious dimension of Ennahda. And so today, Rashid Ghanouchi and his followers see themselves as basically as Muslim Democrats, which means that they are part of the society, they are part of the development of democracy, and they are Muslim Democrats. They do not necessarily have a specific, if you will, Islamist platform and agenda, but they are Muslim Democrats within the political system. And there may be more examples of that also emerging. But religion is certainly religion, both in a narrow sense as well as in a cultural sense, is certainly still very much part of a significant part of the societies.
Thank you so much, John. This was a very fascinating and wonderful discussion, and I hope we can continue in the future with other topics which we didn't get to. And I have another list that unfortunately we didn't get to discuss them. So I want to thank you very much for being with us today. I want to thank also Professor Ovamir Anjum for co-hosting this wonderful program. And I want to remind everybody about tomorrow's program as well. Tomorrow, our guest would be Anwar Ibrahim from Malaysia. And we'll be talking with him also about the many developments that are happening in that part of the world, in that particular country. He is a well-known, obviously, politician as well as intellectual. And now he is the leader of the opposition. Thank you very much for being with us, and hope to see you tomorrow again.